All right, I'm hoping this means we're live. Apologies to everyone waiting a few minutes. We were just dealing with some technical difficulties getting this all set up, but I think we're all good here now. So I will start by saying good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're watching us from. This is our regular quarterly release webinar for HAPI FHIR 6.0.0. Big occasion. We're bumping a major version for HAPI FHIR, as well as Smile CDR 2022.05.R01. This release is, of course, codenamed Tanuki. Uh-oh, we got some echo.
Just dealing with some technical difficulties, getting this all set.
There we go. Sorry about that. Doing it live today. That's good. So, as always, what we'll be talking about today is what is new in the product this quarter, what's coming up in the next quarter, and we will close off, as usual these days, with some Q&A. So, we have a lot to cover today. Let's get to it. So this is our 20th named release. For anyone who's new to the process, we follow the same process that's followed by many software companies these days, where we use alphabetical code names and we rotate through the letters. These names are chosen generally by a poll of smilers within our team. This one, I think there was no question. We absolutely had to choose Tanuki because it's a bit of it's something of a spirit animal to us. So Tanuki, what is a Tanuki? Well, first off, I've got one on my shirt, which I will get up and show off for a second. Until we got into this, I have to admit, I had no idea that Tanukis were a real thing. I have known them for years as the little raccoon suit that Mario puts on in Super Mario Brothers 3, which I played like crazy as a kid, and I know it makes appearances in all kinds of other parts of the Mario franchise as well. The Tanuki suit, of course, I always just called it the raccoon suit when I was a kid. Lets you fly, well, lets you float at least a little bit. Turns out it is based on an actual animal, and I'm sure there's lots of people that knew that well before I did. It took me a long time into adulthood to learn this basic fact, but oh well. The Tanuki is otherwise known as the Japanese raccoon dog, and we've got a photo of one on the screen here. Tanukis are in fact a real animal. They have nothing to do with raccoons, oddly enough, despite looking not exactly like a raccoon, but they look a lot like a raccoon. They were, as I said, a part of the Super Mario Brothers franchise and have had all kinds of appearances through that. But they also feature very prominently in Japanese mythology, and there's all kinds of fascinating stories about that. If you want to learn more about Tanukis, I'd highly recommend the Wikipedia article on it. There's all kinds of adorable pictures of them. Even if you don't want to read, just the pictures are great in that article. So there you go. Tanukis are pretty adorable. And why are we obsessing over these things? Why did we have to choose one? That's, of course, because our HAPI FHIR mascot is a regular raccoon. And anyone who's unclear why that is, it's because we started the project in Toronto, Canada. Toronto is unofficially the raccoon capital of the world. So we love our raccoons. We also hate our raccoons. We do both of those things at the same time around these parts. So what has happened over the last while? We've got a couple of what we like calling these days significant smiles. First off, a massive thank you to everyone who attended, participated, and contributed to our second annual Smile CDR Intelligent Health Data Symposium. The symposium was an absolute roaring success. I watched almost every single talk through the entire thing. There's just all kinds of great content. Everything from big picture strategy all the way down to really low level sort of how do you do A, B, and C using the frameworks and the platform. So lots of really good talks, and the recordings for those talks are available. So there we go. That's smile number one. Smile number two, worth mentioning. This is a big one that I suspect a lot of people didn't realize that we just passed a fascinating milestone in the FHIR standard itself. FHIR 0.0.1, which was the very first release of the spec that was actually called FHIR, was released on May 14th, 2012. So if you think about that, that makes FHIR 10 years old, more or less today, just a couple of days ago. Fascinating stuff. There was one sort of pre-publication release that came before that was called Resources for Health. That was that's the original lineage of the spec, but This is the 10-year anniversary of FHIR, the name, and that was the first version of the spec that looked anything like modern FHIR. So there we go. What a crazy 10 years it's been. We've got a blog post up with a bunch more details about history and some other fascinating tidbits around all of this. So recommended reading if you would like to learn a little bit more about this momentous occasion for the FHIR standard. And finally, the third smile. This is a new thing that we're doing around here. We thought, what does a good release need? A good new product release from us need, if not a playlist? So this is our announcement of the Tanooki release playlist. This is a Spotify playlist, so you can of course listen to it if you have a Spotify account. If you don't, you can still listen to it. You'll probably hear a few ads from Spotify, but it will let you play this. This is a collection of songs curated by what we call the Smile CDR core team, who are the ones who work on our core CDR product. If you'd like to give it a listen, there's a link on the screen here. That QR code will also take you there. And perhaps during the Q&A at the end, I'll come back to the slide and put that QR code back up. So if anyone wants to listen to music instead of our Q&A, by all means, feel free. And I think this the core team playlist, perhaps this is a bit of a throwdown to the rest of the Smile CDR organization to see if any other teams could come up with an even better playlist for our next release. We shall see. So what's new in this release? Let's dive into that. I'm going to start by introducing a new thing that we're doing. We're calling the Smile CDR and HAPI FHIR feature maturity model. The words maturity model, of course, will be familiar to anyone who uses the FHIR specification. FHIR has had this maturity model for a long time in terms of how mature various parts of the spec are, how ready for production use those parts are. We really liked the concept and wanted to apply it to individual features within the product because, of course, we are constantly trying to push the boundaries forward within the product, adding new features. Sometimes we add new features and we consider them fully baked the second they go in. In fact, that's generally how it works. But we do sometimes add new features that we consider to be experiments. We don't know for sure that they're stable. We don't know how they're going to get used. We think maybe they'll change after we get some production use out of them, which is often the way that the FHIR spec itself has grown up. So we've introduced this effectively 4-level maturity model for our features as well. This is not the same maturity model that the standard uses because, of course, we are a very different kind of beast, being a software product. Our maturity levels are experimental, and you can read the definition there. These are things which are certainly expected to change plenty before hitting maturity. Trial, and trial means we consider the feature ready for use, but perhaps not fully documented, perhaps difficult to configure, perhaps just difficult to understand because it's so new. So we would consider those features to require a little bit of extra handholding in order to successfully use. We've got a status of deprecated, which of course takes the standard definition. This is a feature or a flag or something like that we're intending to remove in the future. And of course, anything that does not have one of those 3 labels is considered stable and fully suitable for production use. And most of our product falls into that definition. I will note you will find these labels on our documentation, adorning feature descriptions for things which have one of these labels. You'll also see them as new little icons in our web admin console. It's quite neat actually. If you go to change a setting, next to the setting you may see a little circle or a little square, and if you hover over it or click on it, you'll get a definition of where that particular flag falls into the maturity model. So pretty cool stuff, actually. The main reason that we're bumping up our version to 6.0.0, we're doing a major bump in HAPI FHIR, comes down to a decision that we announced last quarter, which is a decision to bump our JDK version. This is a decision that we do not take lightly. It is honestly a really difficult decision because anytime you update software, platform dependencies, you always run the risk of alienating people who, for one reason or another, are unable to upgrade their own environments. We've decided to move up from Java 8 to Java 11 as our minimum supported version for both Smile CDR and HAPI FHIR. We're doing this for a couple of reasons. Partially, and perhaps most importantly, Java 8 is fast being obsoleted and phased out by the the organizations that maintain Java itself. It's really only on extended support these days, and it will be beyond that pretty quickly as well. Also important, many of the libraries we use, and in fact, much of the Java software community have started to move away from Java 8 as well. So we felt like this is probably the time to do that. We will be maintaining some backwards compatibility for 1 year, the 5.7 and 2022.02 release branches. We'll be providing security fixes, if any are necessary, for at least a year on those two branches. So you do have a year to upgrade and know that you're fully secure. So there we go. One other thing worth mentioning to those people actually building HAPI FHIR, not using the library, but actually building it, which is contributors to the open source library. We now require Java 17 in order to build the software library. And the reason for that is we've upgraded our tests all the way up to Java 17. So that's kind of a nice compromise in terms of getting to use some of the newer language features, but also maintaining good backwards compatibility for people that can't upgrade that far. I will also mention these days we are officially recommending, certainly we don't require this at all, and it's absolutely not a problem if you're not using it, but we are recommending the use of the Amazon Corretto JDK. There are many JDK distributions out there. We have found the Corretto one to be of very good quality, so it's the one that we primarily test against these days. So for what it's worth, that's a recommendation we make. So in terms of new features in the product, I will start with a bit of infrastructure. We announced probably two or three quarters ago a new batch framework, as we're doing again today, previously based on Spring Batch. Spring Batch is a Java library that we were using to execute batch technology, batch jobs, basically. We had high hopes for it when we rolled it out, but really after gaining some implementation experience with it, what we realized is it was a great framework, but just not suited to the types of things that we do in a FHIR server as batch jobs. And those are things like reindexing resources, generating bulk exports, that type of thing. The biggest limitation, which was a constant source of complaints, was that any batch jobs didn't take advantage of the full cluster, nor were they resilient at all against failure. These were just not design goals of the Spring Batch framework that we were using. So we decided rather than continuing to fight with that framework, we would roll our own batch framework, and we've called that Batch 2. And this is a part of HAPI FHIR as well as a part of Smile CDR. So new jobs are getting built in this new framework, and existing jobs are getting rolled in as well. So the reindex, the resource reindexer is already in there, and I'm going to talk about bulk import shortly, but that's in there as well. So we're super excited for Batch 2 to become a pretty pivotal part of the FHIR server ecosystem. We spent, as we do, it seems, every quarter these days, lots of time thinking about MDM. MDM continues to be this great sort of this great tool in your arsenal if you're trying to set up any kind of distributed architecture using FHIR. And more we're seeing people build all kinds of really fascinating, big, complicated architectures. And MDM is just a great part of that. Among the things that we've done, we've added support for partitioned databases and multi-tenancy to MDM. So it is now possible to use the MDM feature within a partitioned database, and that applies to all kinds of different partitioning strategies as well, which is great. We've also added this fascinating new search parameter modifier, which you can use in isolation, but most importantly, I think, is used as a part of the MDM ecosystem. And that's for nickname search parameters. And of course, we've got the example on the screen. You could do a search for Ken and also find Kenneths and Kennys, for example, using the nickname search parameters. It's actually a search parameter modifier. It's a really neat thing, and there's some documentation that goes through how that works exactly. Bulk import. This has been something we have been promising. I have to admit, we've been promising this for, it feels like probably 2 years now. We've been saying it's almost ready, it's almost ready. It turned out to be a whole bunch more work. And the biggest thing is we didn't have this new batch framework, and it was really hard to implement without that. As soon as we had the new batch framework, it became really easy to do the last bit of work to get bulk import in. So the official FHIR Bulk Data Access IG specification for bulk import is now fully supported in both HAPI FHIR and Smile CDR. This is great for all kinds of reasons. It does mean you can use a bulk export to take those files and re-import them into another server. That works really well. It's also, of course, a big part of the DaVinci implementation guide for pair-to-pair data transfer. So lots of reasons you might choose to use a bulk import, and now we do support it. So that is great. This is, of course, marked as trial, which means we do consider it stable for production use, but it is a bit of a, it can be a little challenging to get up and running and configured. So we decided to go with this this trial label for now. I suspect as we gain some implementation experience there, we will be dropping that label. And there's your first example of the new maturity model in action, which is great. This is one for the developers. This is a Smile CDR feature. Probably, at least in my opinion, the coolest thing that went into the release in the last quarter, just because it's been something people have been asking for years. Something we always assumed would be really hard to do. And perhaps if anyone wants to know more about the inner workings, Ken was actually the one that discovered we could do this. Without too much fuss. We now have support for remote JavaScript debugging of any callback scripts that you've got in your Smile CDR installation. And by remote, really what we mean there is what you're actually doing is taking advantage of a browser debugger. So you'll see the screenshot on the screen there. That's actually the regular JavaScript debugger coming out of a Chrome window, like the Chrome browser. It's JavaScript debugger. It's just fascinating to watch. You can examine variable contents, you can change variable contents, you can do step overs and add breakpoints, all the usual things you would expect out of a debugger. Those are all supported there. So absolutely fascinating. And certainly this has been called for by developers for a long time. So I think we've already had lots of feedback. So people are very excited to start using this feature. As always, we continue to work on CDA as an exchange mechanism. We support, of course, both HL7 version 2 and HL7 CDA as input and output formats for Smile CDR. We have spent tons of effort in the last quarter working on our ability to ingest CCDs, which are continuity of care documents. We do automatically translate those into FHIR. As you can see on this slide, we've got all kinds of support for most of the major sections you would expect to have to want to capture out of a CCD. And of course, over the next while, we're going to be adding further support for additional sections based on feedback that continues to roll in terms of how people are using this feature. So very cool. Another interesting one that's been added, this one you will note is marked experimental just because it's brand new and has had almost no use outside of test use. But I do expect it's going to work really well. We do now support for our binary externalization feature, which has existed for a long time. You can now use AWS S3 buckets as an externalization mechanism. So that's one of the supported mechanisms for our binary externalization features. It is worth mentioning you can use S3 itself. You can also use MinIO, which is an S3 clone. We do support that and have tested against MinIO as well. If you've never seen MinIO, it's one of my favorite open source projects. They have a complete open source implementation of the S3 system that you can run locally if you want. It just deploys as a little Docker container. So very cool stuff. I think it's quite neat. We are, of course, intending to support the equivalents to S3 on other clouds as well. Certainly Azure is next in line. We've had a few people ask about that, but the equivalents on things like the Google Cloud platform and the Oracle Cloud naturally will be coming shortly after as well, because we know people are going to need those as well, and are seeing deployments on those excellent platforms as well. We have so this is another really interesting behind the scenes enhancement. So for relational database repositories, so HAPI FHIR JPA users and Smile CDR RDBMS storage users, we have undertaken this massive behind the scenes exercise to retune and reorganize our SQL indexes, our database indexes, to provide faster searches, and more importantly, to optimize them for the ways that people tend to typically query actual FHIR servers. So lots of work has gone in. We do continue to work on indexes, so there'll probably be some more that will be tuned in the next quarter, but already we're seeing some significant speed ups for various usage patterns. The retuned indexes will automatically tune themselves if you're using either the CLI tool to upgrade your database, or if you're using Smile CDR and letting it manually upgrade or automatically update the database when it starts. So not much manual intervention required there, if any, but we will. You do get some fancy new indexes added to your database. We've also, a much smaller thing, but we've also added support for underscore includes, bringing in resources that are linked by canonical references. Previously, we only supported the standard, resource type / resource ID style of reference, which is the majority of references anyhow. But there are good scenarios for using canonical. They are now supported for includes, which is great. On the MongoDB side, this is a long overdue feature. First off, we have finally added support for reindexing. The biggest blocker there, of course, was we didn't have any ability to run long-running batch jobs in our MongoDB repository. With the new batch framework, one of the design goals there was that it would work on both MongoDB as well as on relational databases, and that it would work in the exact same way, so that we could design batch jobs that would work, that would basically have parity the second they were written. That was quite a successful strategy, and the proof of that being successful is the fact that reindex all of a sudden just started working for MongoDB with a tiny bit of tweaking to it to make it suitable there. So that's great. We've also added support for a few numeric and date prefixes on searches that weren't supported previously. And another feature that's often been requested by people who are doing test scenarios. Generally, this is more useful for testing than for production use, but we have added the expunge everything operation, which already existed on the relational side and now works on Mongo as well. Expunge is all around deleting data, but also like logically deleting data using a FHIR delete, but also physically deleting it from the underlying database. Expunge can be used for that. And finally, on the repository enhancements, we continue to work on enhancements to Elasticsearch. This is another one of these really cool things that's sort of chugging along in the background in terms of making the product better for all kinds of fancy uses. We debuted a long time ago experimental support for last N searching. And last N searching, this is a FHIR operation on the observation resource type called $last N. It's used to pull back the most recent N observations of a collection of types generally for a specific patient. So if you wanted to find the last height and weight observations and, I don't know, blood sugar readings and a few other things. So you could draw up a set of spark lines, for example, for a specific patient. Last N can do that in a single query. We did not previously support that in Smile because we considered it too experimental. It was only at HAPI FHIR. We have decided it's no longer too experimental for Smile, so it's now experimental in Smile as well. We are really looking forward to getting some production mileage out of this feature, so that we can, or at least some testing mileage out of this, so that we can move it beyond the experimental phase. It is a really cool feature, I have to say. Remaining only in HAPI, and these Elasticsearches are sort of following this trajectory, just because they are much more out there in terms of being experimental than most other features. We now have an ability, if you are using Elasticsearch, for some searches to be served completely out of Elasticsearch, meaning that there is no talking to the relational database at all as a part of the search chain, which is, I won't spend any more time talking about it than that because it's an entire topic on its own, but it really does help for performance on specific queries that you're using with Elasticsearch. Hopefully at some point we'll put up a blog post talking a little bit more about the benefits of Elasticsearch on large data sets, because we really can do some neat stuff with it. And of course, we continue to work on expanding what we can index with Elasticsearch. We just see this combination of a relational database and Elasticsearch as being just an amazing combination in terms of both robust storage, but also then great discoverability of the data that's in the server. One more feature. I think we're almost at the end of new features. We have added what's called the OpenID Connect Key Store Manager to Smile CDR. This is a brand new configuration area that we're using to centralize the storage of key stores. Effectively, to start with, we're dealing only with the key stores that are used as a part of your OIDC infrastructure, but we are actually hoping over time we're gonna roll into this thing support for key vaults, things like the secrets manager in Amazon, things like HashiCorp and those types of systems as well that can be used for credential and certificate vaulting. We also are hoping to sort of roll this into other types of key stores as well. Most importantly, SSL and TLS key stores that are used for HTTP HTTP encrypting. That's the word I'm looking for. So lots to come there for sure as we continue to move that. Oh, what's going on here? Oops. One final thing I will mention, there is, of course, a lot of sensitivity in the Java software realm these days around libraries with security vulnerabilities. Of course, people remember there was a very famous vulnerability in the Log4j framework called Log4Shell about, I think, 5 months ago that made really big waves. Fortunately, we were not vulnerable to that, but we did have to respond because everybody was quite concerned about it, and rightly so. We do want to mention there was a release or a vulnerability found in the Spring library, which we do use. This vulnerability was found perhaps a month ago. It is worth mentioning, we do not believe that HAPI FHIR or Smile CDR are vulnerable. We've done detailed assessments of the attack vectors to this vulnerability, and we do not use any of the affected code paths. So it should not be possible to exploit this vulnerability on any version of our product. That said, we do ship a version of the library that lists itself as being vulnerable. So we certainly have upgraded and provided patches to previous versions of the software as well. Just recognizing that people are running automated scans very, very frequently, as they should be doing against software that they've got running in production. So we do recommend upgrading anyhow, just so that you'll have a green clear security scan if you're scanning any of the software you've got running. Quickly, I will talk about AppSphere. The AppSphere platform continues to grow. We're really excited about it. Most importantly, it is now possible to launch apps directly from the gallery, which is super cool. I mean, the gallery is turning more and more into a full-featured app gallery that people would deploy into their organizational ecosystem to allow discoverable apps, either for their own internal users or for their customers, depending on the type of gallery you're setting up. So lots of good stuff coming there. We now support Markdown as a mechanism for documenting and describing the apps and the various text that goes with them. We've also added a bunch of new workflow, so we'll log people out when they're inactive. We're allowing incomplete app registrations to be saved and continued later. So this platform just continues to grow and continues to get cooler and cooler as it grows. Big shout out to the team working on this thing. The whole AppSphere platform, certainly well beyond just the gallery, is just a tremendous piece of software these days that is hugely useful to organizations that are adopting FHIR. Quickly on the payer-to-payer solution, it is worth mentioning that we have spent tons of time working on various features for this. We've added support for granular consent, and granular consent, of course, is if you're unfamiliar with the term, is this catch-all term for I want to allow authorization of my data as it's flowing from one payer to another. I want to specifically authorize sensitive parts of the data. So if there are parts of my record that are particularly sensitive, perhaps I would want to either include or exclude them, depending on how I feel about that. That is fully allowed now. We've added a bunch of APIs to the system as well. And we've also added support for basically transferring between payers provenance resources, and that includes automatically generating, but also storing and tagging them as a part of the record. Certainly a number of things listed on the screen. I won't itemize them just because we're getting towards the end of our allocated time here, but lots to come in the next quarter as well for the payer-to-payer solution as well. I will mention, if this particular feature is interesting to you, chances are you're working in the payer industry. And if that is the case, we do have an upcoming webinar. It's, I believe, scheduled for late June. That is going to be our first quarterly payer-focused webinar. So similar in nature a little bit to this release webinar. We're going to be doing it hopefully once a quarter, but with a focus specifically on what's interesting for payers, and perhaps with a little bit more of an educational bent as well. So do watch for communication there. We'll be announcing that on our blog, I think, in the coming weeks, and presumably on Twitter and all of the usual channels. I'm sure LinkedIn will have posts about it as well. All the places you would go to for that. So there we go. What's coming up next? Smile CDR, of course, we are implementing the CDEX IG as we speak, which is great. We are continuing to work on imports for various types of CDA. Coming up very next, of course, is import for the US CDI data set, which is certainly commonly used within that world. We are working through, this is actually, we probably should have led with this one. It's probably the most interesting part of all of this for MongoDB users, is we are integrating support for MDM. We've had just endless architectural discussions in the last quarter about how that should work. I think we've landed on the design, and now we're going to get to implementing it, which is very exciting. As you can see, Expunge, actually, Expunge we've already finished, so I'm not sure why that's on that list, but oh well. Sharding is also on deck as well, support for sharding, which is, as we have discovered, a very important strategy for growing your database on MongoDB. I mean, certainly that's not a surprise to anyone, but we were surprised by how quickly we needed that feature, so we're quickly working on it now. As well as address normalization using an external normalization service for any MDM people, anyone who's using MDM for person, patient, practitioner, those types of resources. We will continue to address the new batch framework in terms of migrating existing jobs over and improving the performance of batch jobs. As I mentioned earlier, we'll continue to work on Elasticsearch. And additionally, on AppSphere, as we say here, we'll be working on workflows for basically to allow sort of time boxing of getting apps registered in order to comply with the upcoming 2023 version of the CMS proposed rules. So there we go. That is those are the high notes of what we've been working on in the last quarter and what we're going to be working on next quarter. I thank everyone for listening. This is the end of the feature part of this webinar, but of course, if you'd like, you're welcome to stick around. As usual, we will be jumping to Q&A for the section, and Q&A this quarter is going to be moderated by Jenny Ray. Jenny, I'm completely blanking on your new title, so I'm hoping you could start by introducing yourself with that. Jenny's got a new title here.
Sure, yeah, so nice to meet everyone. I'm Jenny, the Technical Product Manager for Core CDR. So working closely with Ken on all the exciting new developments coming out of Core CDR. And yeah, the great content in there. I think there's like so many different features that we've released this time that I think will support like a lot of different clients, from clinical use cases down to more developer integrations with the JavaScript support. So yeah, exciting to see. Also, did just want to mention on the expunge operation, while we wait for questions to come through, we do want to make an additional couple of improvements. We have the delete all the system level support, so we wanted to add the additional granular ones for instance and type level, have a bit more control over there.
Thank you for that. That makes perfect sense.
And I am loving our t-shirts. I think we look very cute. So shout out to the team for those. I hope they ordered more. I think they'll be in high demand. Great. So I can get started with I have some internal questions while we wait for them to come on through YouTube. So one is around vendor-specific versions and containerized deployment. So as cloud technologies develop, we're seeing vendor-specific versions of certain technologies, such as Azure SQL servers, Amazon and Azure's messaging queue services, and their containerized deployments. So do you have any insight as to Smile's strategy on supporting those in the future?
That's a fun one. Ken, you want to take that, or do you want me to? I'm certainly happy to.
You go ahead.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So I guess, I mean, I think there's two topics in there. Certainly, first off, the vendor specific services. This has been a fascinating one for us. Certainly, I mean, the best example of this is we do naturally, we support Kafka as a messaging engine within Smile CDR. It gets used for subscriptions. It actually also gets leveraged if it's available for the new batch framework. So it's quite a useful piece of technology. And I think these days we would recommend using Kafka with Smile CDR, unless your use case is so simple it wouldn't benefit from any kind of distribution of load at all. However, every cloud seems to have their own flavor of Kafka. You know, Azure, for instance, has Azure Event Hub, which is their built-in messaging engine. It's an excellent messaging engine. It does speak the Kafka protocol. I don't totally know all the nuance internally as to how much of Kafka it's actually using, or whether it's just re-implementing the API surface. I suspect I should know that, but I actually have no idea internally. It is worth mentioning, I mean, every time anyone's got their own flavor, there are always little tweaks. We are doing our best to ensure that we're testing on all of them. But it is a difficult hill to climb, just because you know, there's always going to be more that we didn't realize existed, or you know, different ways of configuring these services we didn't realize existed. I use the Azure one as an example just because we know we've got loads of customers in production today using Azure Event Hub, so we do make a very concerted effort to test and make sure that we're working well with that specific platform, as well as just with vanilla Kafka, of course. There are others out there as well that you know, that we are testing, but perhaps less frequently, just because we're not aware of a ton of customer demand on them. So certainly it's worth mentioning. I mean, if anyone has a specific vendor extension for any of these things, we'd love to hear about it. Other examples of technology specific to clouds, I mean, another really good one is the secrets managers. Every cloud that you know, might deploy to, whether it's you know, Amazon Web Services or Azure or Oracle's cloud, they've all got some sort of facility for managing things like database credentials and certificates for TLS and that type of thing. We are absolutely endeavoring to support all of these things. I'm not going to say we support every last one of them today. Absolutely, we don't. But we are, as customer demand comes in, adding support. So, for example, you can pull database credentials out of the Amazon Secrets Manager. We've got an active development ticket as we speak for a mechanism to pull SSL certificates out of the Azure Secrets Manager, I believe it's called. So we are endeavoring to support these things as well. Certainly worth mentioning there. If there are specific cloud-specific features you'd like us to support, we'd love to hear about it. We do tend to do this by customer demand. So there we go. We do try and roll this all into the same distribution of the product. This is quite, it's really important to us that we don't have 18 different binaries and you have to pick the exact right binary version of Smile in order to do the thing you're doing. So we roll one distribution. It does include customizations for each of the clouds that can be turned on via feature flags. And hopefully in the future will auto turn on just by the fact that they figure out where they're running. We shall see.
Awesome, sounds good. Okay, we have a couple of coming through on YouTube now. So the new batch framework is getting people excited. Can you explain in a little more detail, particularly around what has been changed or enhanced?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess the best way to describe it is Spring Batch. The way Spring Batch works is, like, if you think about what a batch job is, you've got little chunks of some sort of work that perhaps you're reading in from a database, making manipulations to, and then writing back to a file. I mean, that's a simple example of something that could be a batch job. The way that the Spring Batch framework works is it stores the individual chunks of work in a database and has an in-memory process that sort of is constantly reading from the database, doing work on it, and then streaming it back to the database as it completes its work. The challenges we had with this old framework, the biggest challenge really was that it was really hard to deal with any kind of fault tolerance. If this ran on a single JVM, and if that JVM happened to go away, which is a thing, especially in Kubernetes environments where you expect containers to be coming up and down, it sort of meant that if the container all of a sudden went away in the middle of execution of a job, there wasn't any automatic way for work to continue. That framework just didn't support that well. There are mechanisms for working around this. If anyone is an expert with Spring Batch, you're probably cringing inside that I'm skipping the fact that you can solve these problems with Spring Batch. But we just felt like we had to fight with that framework, and that the types of jobs that we tend to need here just weren't well suited. Like Spring Batch really is a big data framework. It's intended around massaging and manipulating data as you stream it in large quantities, and that just isn't the nature of batch jobs that we've got. We're doing things like reindexing data, generating exports, and things like that, and indexing terminology. So we needed a different kind of framework. So all of that to say, what's different? The new framework works still with this concept of chunks of work. That part never goes away. But what's really, and those chunks are persisted in a database, so they are resilient and all of that. What's important though is instead of being orchestrated by a sort of an in-JVM process, they're now orchestrated by a messaging engine. And that messaging engine is more fault tolerant. Certainly if it's configured to be, this is one of the big enhancements in the Smile CDR sort of enhancement to the batch 2 framework. Once you've got it all configured with Kafka working against it, it will distribute your load entirely across your cluster if you need it to. So this really will, I think this brings a whole lot more value in terms of how we run these jobs effectively with Kafka managing the show as well. That means that it actually doesn't matter at all if an individual JVM goes down, because Kafka just won't send any work there. It just send works to whatever nodes remain up, which is great.
Awesome. So speaking of Kafka, it's a good segue into the next question. Are you seeing uptake of the Kafka pub sub capabilities being adopted for streaming FHIR data, streaming purposes across the ecosystem? It's from Shane.
Oh, that's fun. Ken?
Well, certainly we've added support for ingesting data through Kafka and producing data out through Kafka. So there definitely is increased interest in that. Those were, I mean, they're not in this release, but in recent releases. We're seeing increased interest in that.
I'd say the export is, I mean, I think the question was mostly about the producing and the subscription capabilities that go out. I mean, for what it's worth, I don't totally know all of the use cases, but it is, we get questions about it all the time. Like, how do I set this up? So I know it's actually seen quite a bit of adoption because we've walked quite a few people through how to set it up, and they've seemed quite happy with the results. I suspect the general idea, I mean, it makes perfect sense, is that having subsets of your data, like having all of your data centralized in a FHIR server, but then having subsets go out onto specific Kafka topics so that you can do things like execute Lambda functions against them to do processing, or have your own application that you've written receive those notifications of subsets of your data so that they can alert users or process them or store them in other systems. I think that's that is increasingly a popular architecture. And I mean, it really comes down to, these days, we're starting to talk about Smile, the platform, not as just a repository, not as just a CDR, but as a data fabric. And I think that architecture really sort of gets to the heart of why we're doing that. We do see this central repository as not just a place for storing your data, but as a core platform that is going to help you move your data around, react to your data, understand your data, all of those good things. So, I mean, I think that's one big part of the architecture that really turns us into a proper data fabric.
Shifting gears to the P2P roadmap, is there any mention of delegation for a personal representative on the P2P roadmap under consent management?
I love it. Yes, absolutely there is. Yeah, this is a really hot topic. Naturally, for anyone who's not familiar with P2P, first off, I mean, P2P, it's deceptively simple. I mean, it's actually very complicated to implement, but the concept is really simple. If I've got my health payer is one payer, and I move, perhaps I've moved to another state, so now I've got a different plan, or I've changed employers or something like that. Now I've got a different plan. P2P is just plain about a simple electronic, user, me-controlled way for me to request that my data get transferred from my old payer to my new payer. So that's the concept. Very simple stuff. What really makes it complicated, and there's all kinds of nuance here. There's things like how do we make sure the data models are consistent? How do we deal with the fact that perhaps there are multiple identities for me even within a single plan? There's all kinds of complexity to deal with around the data. But one of the other really difficult parts is around delegation of access, just because, of course, in the simple case, it's me making this request on my own behalf, and I suspect in many cases that's how it's going to work. But as we know with healthcare, it is incredibly common for people to need assistance for one reason or another. I mean, perhaps the patient is someone elderly who doesn't want to be using the technology or doesn't understand the technology. Perhaps it's somebody with physical limitations who requires a caregiver or something like that to be helping them with this technology. For any situation like that, we naturally need an ability for delegate access. We need the ability for somebody to go in and request this transfer on behalf of someone that they're authorized to do that for. There is all kinds of challenge in there. As they say, there be dragons in implementing that system. It is really, I mean, it's technically really easy to build that so that I could delegate access to somebody else to do it. But getting it right from a security context is challenging, of course. Like, I want to set this up so that Ken can't just go and say, oh yeah, of course, trust me, I can get James's data. We can't allow that. We have to set it up in a way where it's secure, and Ken can only do that if he has good reason to be allowed to do that, or if James has authorized it previously or something like that. So we are working through all the nuances of that. That is absolutely a big hot topic here, and we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that it can get integrated with all of the ways that these relationships are already modeled within the payers, because of course, we don't want to reinvent the wheel as far as modeling these relationships and delegations of access and that type of thing. So all of that was a really long-winded way of saying, yes, we are absolutely working through these challenges. This is for sure on the roadmap. I don't know I can give an exact date, but we would certainly be happy to discuss this in more depth with anyone that wanted to.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think we are, well, a lot of us are aware of the privacy standards and the confusing rules around them. So it's understandable, and yeah, good to see that we are making progress on it. One thing that we didn't mention in the release webinar, but we added support for generating a provenance resource for P2P and being able to inject that into the workflow. So how does that aid in real-time clinical and financial workflows? Have any insight into how that could help with other workflows in addition to P2P?
Oh, yeah, great. I'll be honest, that's a bit of a stumper for me. Certainly, I mean, this feels like something perhaps that we could explore further on the payer specific webinar. I guess I will say, I mean, provenance resources they're fascinating things. They're intended to store the provenance of data, of course, and they're a nice little data model for tracking where did this data come from. There's all kinds of fascinating nuance in that, though. I mean, as we move to a world where data is increasingly distributed, the payer to payer is such a great example. I might be transferring data from my previous payer to my new payer. And of course, the provenance there is pretty simple. You think it's pretty simple because, the data came from the previous payer. They were the ones that provided it. And now it's being provided to the new payers. The new payer just stores it came from the previous payer. Simple, right? Except that as soon as you start digging into how that works, I mean, where did my former payer get that data? Like, they might have gotten it from a provider. They might have gotten it from a fax they received where they don't actually understand where the fax came from. They might have received it from a previous P2P exchange where it came from yet another payer, and that other payer perhaps didn't properly track the provenance. So there's all kinds of really neat nuance in there that I mean, it's really challenging. Like, thinking through how we deal with this stuff is difficult. I guess, I think the FHIR community as a whole are going to continue to iterate on these concepts. Like, I don't think this is an unsolvable problem by any means. But certainly I think it's one where both the use cases and the solutions and the challenges and all of that, Smile can't operate in a vacuum. We continue to work with the broader FHIR community, all of our great friends and all of the other great companies that are working in this space. I think as a community, we're continuing to iterate on these to come up with what are the problems and what are their solutions. That is, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That's a pretty evasive answer to what is actually a really interesting question. But I guess the TLDR there is we're continuing to figure that out ourselves.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think we welcome feedback on that as well. If we have clients testing it out for different workflows, we'd be happy to hear that. So regarding CDA, with Smile increasing their CDA support, how do you see CDA and FHIR working in tandem for increased interoperability in the years to come?
Oh, I love it. So, I mean, CDA and FHIR are such, like in many ways, in some ways, they're really compatible standards. I mean, you look at a CDA document, it's a bunch of sections with discrete clinical data and with narratives. And I mean, FHIR can represent that perfectly. So what's really easy is just mapping the data from a CDA document into a FHIR resource and storing it. And the reverse is just as easy. We certainly have we've had the ability for a long time now to take FHIR data, convert to CDA, and send those CDA documents out. So that part, like that, it's easy to describe, but here where the challenge is really more in the intent of how these documents get used. A CDA, a FHIR repository, I think in most cases, this isn't by any means a rule or something that everybody does, but I think in many cases, a FHIR repository is a living record. It's something where we're constantly adding data to, but we're also perhaps updating data when that changes. If James's address changes, we're going to update the patient resource about him. If he does a new blood pressure reading, we're going to add a new observation and tag it with the patient reference back to my patient object. And as I do searches against it, if more data is available, I will see that new data. If data has changed, I will get it. So it's a living repository, I guess, is the point there. CDA documents they're almost the opposite of that. They're intended to capture a snapshot in time that I could sort of use as a little summary and send out to somebody. That includes all of the data as it was at the moment I sent it. Somebody can receive it, and it's like this immutable summary of what data looked like, which, I mean, makes perfect sense. Like CDA is intended to, it's not entirely intended to replace the facts. I think that's really short selling the purpose of CDAs, but a big use case there is that it provides this nice mechanism for replacing the old clunky faxes with an electronic communication that has the same information, both in narrative and discrete data form. But much like the fax, it's not intended to be living data. It's intended to be something you can look at and almost form sort of a legal record that is, we can go back and say, I acted on this data because this is the way it looked at the moment I received it. So why is that interesting? It's interesting because it does present a challenge in terms of what do we do with the data when we store it. We could certainly just create a document reference that just includes the CDA document as a CDA document, not even convert it to FHIR. That's a thing that can be done, and I've seen people do, and there's good reasons for doing it. We are, that is doable, but I think not that interesting because we do have the ability, of course, to convert to FHIR, which gives you much more, I think much better data by the time you're done. At least in terms of how usable the data is, not necessarily the semantic quality of it or anything like that. The question, though, is what do you do with these resources? Do you overwrite existing resources with them? Do you store them as a FHIR document? I think that ultimately comes down to the use cases for what you're trying to do. I think in many cases, the right thing to do with a CDA document is to create basically a FHIR document and store it as a bundle with all of its contents intact, because I think that mirrors the original intent for CDA. And that is a thing that you can do with the CDA support that we've got. There are cases, though, where you might want to pull those resources out and create top-level resources as well. Certainly, it would make perfect sense that if we don't already have a patient resource representing the subject of your CDA, you would store that as a discrete resource and then link your CDA to it so that you've got this ability to search by patient. Ken looks like he wants to add something. Allergies would be another great one. Yep. If you wanted to, even better, if you wanted to store your allergies as discrete resources and then use MDM and the golden resource feature of the MDM product to create a best known allergy set based on all the CDA documents you've received. Like that feels like a slam dunk of a use case for both the CDA import and the allergy and the MDM feature. And certainly as we start to think increasingly as the data fabric as an HIE, which is a thing that we're talking about a lot these days, I think capabilities like that will become super critical in terms of providing the best possible value out of your data info structure. So there we go. Hopefully that gets to some of the heart of that question. I love that question, by the way.
Nice. Yeah, we've been having a lot of those conversations internally about how to handle the nuances and the issues around like creating the resources. So yeah, sounds good. We did have a question on the JavaScript debugging. So with the remote debugging now added for the JavaScript execution environment, will we see things like module imports also supported in future releases?
I guess I will say I really hope we will. Ken, you look puzzled. I'm suspecting.
I didn't understand the question. What was it?
So I'm betting what's getting at here is things like if I wanted to use like an NPM module to bring in a specific JavaScript library, as opposed to like, which is a thing we've had lots of people ask for. I feel like it's a great idea. There's all kinds of little tricky things that have prevented us from ever really moving forward with it, but I think it's a great idea, and I mean I'll almost guarantee we will add that feature at some point before too long. It's just a matter of us figuring out exactly how it should work.
Yeah.
The challenges there, of course, are around like how do you presumably don't want to import one version of a module and then have it apply to all of your scripts, because what if you want to upgrade it, like, and you want to test each individual script, or maybe you do want it to be a global thing. Like we have to figure out how that's going to work. Those are decisions we have to make.
Yeah, and also things like importing other scripts, so you can break up things like consent server scripts.
Yeah.
I think we're coming out of time. There was one question around a recommended MySQL database version for HAPI FHIR JPA server. I'm not sure if that was answered offline.
So I guess truthfully, this is probably a good time to say it, to mention, and hopefully this isn't too bad of news. We have moved support for MySQL into the deprecated status for both HAPI FHIR and Smile CDR. We no longer actually recommend the use of MySQL. We are not intending, at least I'd say we have no plans to withdraw support for it. So it's not like we're going to break MySQL at any point in the future. And if you've got data in MySQL and it's working for you, I mean, that's fine. I'm certainly not too fussed about that. The reason we no longer recommend MySQL, and this was an announcement we made last quarter, like at the previous webinar, is mostly around the fact that MySQL, just because of the fact that it doesn't support native database sequences and the way it does index is a little bit different than other databases in some ways, it just tends to perform worse than any of the other platforms. Like the speed comparisons for SQL Server and Oracle and Postgres, all three of them tend to be great and fast, and then MySQL tends to lag way below it in terms of both raw reads, both raw writes, and raw writes. So we don't really recommend MySQL just because it tends to run into performance challenges way faster than the other platforms. However, if you've got it working and it's performing to a level that's acceptable for you, then I mean that's good. Ultimately, the question of what version do we support, perhaps the best answer to that would be to check. We use Hibernate, of course, as our ORM, and certainly checking the supported versions of MySQL for Hibernate would give you a good answer to that question. However, it is worth mentioning we don't test very actively with MySQL anymore because we don't recommend it. So if you are on MySQL, I mean, our recommendation would be to at least consider moving to Postgres. It just plain is a better performing database these days, at least for the ways that we use it. I certainly don't mean to say that MySQL can't be fast. It just isn't in the ways that we use a relational database.
Makes sense. All right. Deirdre did just correct me that we did mention provenance injection in P2P. I left it out of the core CDR slides because I assumed it would be mentioned in P2P, but then forgot all about it. Okay. But yeah, I think that wraps up all the questions we had. So I'll pass it back to you, James, to wrap up.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Ken and Jenny for joining us. Thank you to everyone watching. This is, as always, great questions. I love these Q&As. We always get some fascinating things. I will post, once we've got the video all cleaned up, we will be posting it. And I will include the Spotify link as well to anyone that's desperate to listen to what are the songs that the HAPI FHIR and Smile CDR developers are into this month. And we will see. So we'll see everyone next time. Thank you.